Good day, everyone. We are the Group 1 and we will be tackling all about the history of civil engineering. So first, what is civil engineering? According to Frederick S. Merritt, civil engineering is the field of engineering concerned with planning, design, and construction for environmental control, development of natural resources, buildings, transportation facilities, and other structures required for health, welfare, safety, employment, and pleasure of mankind. It's hard to know where civil engineering really comes from or how it got its name, but still, most of us can identify that what the history have worked on is part of civil engineering, from inhabiting caves to using trees as passages between riverbanks. The very first identified practice of civil engineering occurred around 4000 to 2000 BC in ancient Egypt and ancient Iraq or Mesopotamia, where humans started abandoning their nomadic way of living. During this time, development of wheels and sailing happened due to increased needs of transportation. Until modern time, there was no clear difference between civil engineering and architecture and was referred only to the same person. It is only recently that engineers whose duties are civil and non-military were categorized as civil engineers to differentiate from military engineers, which were people who makes machines of war. Before, bridges, waterways, fortification, and machines for wars were considered as projects accomplished by military engineers. Kings, queens, emperors, or pharaohs needed these in order to strengthen their ruled place and an ultimate form of self-promotion. Obviously, before naming it as civil engineers were continuously existing. Those endued with the responsibility of making ideas and solving problems in relation to construction, transportation, water irrigation, and city planning were engineers.
Now let's proceed to the civilizations that practiced or used civil engineering. First is ancient Egypt. On 4000 to 200 BC, their contribution are its pyramids, circa 2700 to 2500 BC. Next is ancient Mesopotamia, which is presently known today as Iraq, back on 4000 to 200 BC. Some of their contributions are the ruins of Babylon, the ziggurat, the Karnak water management system, and the Sennacherib's aqueduct. Third is ancient Greece on 447 to 438 BC. And their famous contribution to the civil engineering is their Parthenon. Fourth is ancient Rome, circa 312 BC. They're famous for their Appian Way. Fifth is ancient China, circa 220 BC, with their Great Wall of China. Sixth is ancient Sri Lanka. They're known for their Jetavana-Ramaya Stupa. Seventh is ancient Peru, with the very famous Machu Picchu, which was built on 1450. So just by looking at the structures, what can you say? Or what have you observed upon looking at them? Yes, you guessed it right. Each of the structures are built different, not just on the way of its design, but also in the materials that were used in building them. That's because the materials that were used in building those structures were chosen based on their availability, and also on the climate of that place. Just like, for example, on the pyramids in ancient Egypt. The Egyptians used stones and clays in building those structures. Same goes with ancient Mesopotamia. Just like, for example, the ruins of Babylon. That's because they were built in an alluvial plain, meaning there's no wood, so the materials that they used were mostly clay and stones. So they used sun-dried clays and stacked them up together in order to build those kinds of walls. So next is the Great Wall of China. Since it was built on a mountain, they were able to utilize wood, and at the same time they also used stones in building the wall or the said structures. Next is Machu Picchu. Since it was built on the mountainside, there were no mud, clay, or dirt. And since it was mostly rock, they only rely on dry cut stones, in which they dry cut them and perfectly fit them together right next to each other in order to build those kinds of structures.
Here are the two most influential civil engineers throughout the history. Archimedes of Syracuse was the greatest mathematician of his age. His contribution to geometry revolutionized the subject and methods anticipated in integral calculus. He was a practical man who invented a variety of machines including pulleys and the Archimedean screw pumping machine. He was also the most famous mathematician and inventor in ancient Greece. He discovered the relation between the surface and the volume of a sphere and its circumscribing cylinder. In relation to this, in the year 225 BCE, he published a book in 2 volumes which were entitled as On the Sphere and Cylinder. He was known for the formulation of hydrostatic principle or the Archimedes principle and the device for raising water which was known as the Archimedes screw. Here are the contributions of Archimedes. Archimedes principle, the Sandwich corner, evaluation of pi, the law of Archimedes, Archimedes' screw, Archimedes' letter ray, the odometer, Archimedes' catapults, the law of the lever, the discovery of the infinitesimals, shapes and their design, and the most known contribution, the formula for the surface area and the area of a sphere.
The next most influential person in civil engineering throughout the history is John Smeaton. John Smeaton is the father of civil engineering. He designed the New Edison Lighthouse, also known as the Smeaton's Tower of the Cross of Plymouth, after it was destroyed by a fire in December 1755. He just started out his civil engineering career while he did the job, and the success of the project led to him becoming one of the busiest civil engineering in 1771, which became the Smeatonian Society of Civil Engineers after his death. He established the term civil engineer in 1750. His most famous work was the Eddy Lighthouse. But he also had notable successes with at least 35 other major civil engineering projects, and it includes the following. The first one is the Scotland Spanning Fort in Clyde Canal. The second is the Ramsgate Harbor. The third is Perth Bridge, and as well as over 60 mills and more than 10 steam engineers. Now, let's talk about the history of civil engineering in the Philippines. So, during the Spanish time, the history of architecture and civil engineering profession in the Philippines were almost synonymous to each other. In more than 3.5 centuries of Spanish subjugation, there were no Filipino civil engineers. Social prejudice constrained the repressed Indio builders to content themselves to be called mere maestro de obras or master builders, even if they could design and build any type of structure that technology could allow at that time. Master builders, as of today, were equivalent to construction foreman. Civil engineering as practiced in the Philippines during the Spanish era was not by virtue of an academic title. There were no civil engineering schools in the country at that time, and the only architects or engineers with academic degrees were Spaniards. The walled city in Intramuros was established by the Spaniards as a model community. The friar architects or engineers during that time were the ones who built the government buildings, bridges, residential, and other structures, incorporated European standards in engineering and architectural installation. During the 18th and 19th centuries, Filipino engineers were assigned the task of maintaining, repairing, and remodeling infrastructure systems in all pueblos or towns, including churches, convents, and government buildings. Maestro de obras were called by the ilustrados or the elite group to build structures in villas and mansions.
The coming of the Americans brought about drastic changes in our engineering culture. The new colonizers pursued benevolent or kind policies that focused on English education, public health, free enterprise, and representative governance, thus bringing with them were military engineers, Thomasite teachers, doctors, and evangelists. Under the civil government established in July 1901, such assimilation manifested itself physically in the form of infrastructures. Highways, bridges, schools, and government buildings steadily transformed the Philippine landscape. In the year 1902, when Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States in 1898, the public works and activities were placed under the U.S. Army Engineers. On February 6, 1901, by the virtue of Act No. 83 passed by the Philippine Commission, public works were placed under the provincial supervisions. Thus, Bureau of Engineering and Construction of Public Works and the Bureau of Architecture and Construction of Public Buildings were created by Act Numbers 222 and 268 of the Philippine Commission were placed under the Department of Commerce and Police.
In 1907, the Faculty of Engineering of the University of Santo Tomas or the UST is the oldest engineering school in the Philippines. It was established on May 18, 1907. A school of civil engineering with one program offering leading to the degree of Master of Science in Civil Engineering or the MSCE. From faculty records, it appears that it was only in 1912 when the earliest batch of students was conferred their MSCE degrees.
In the year 1928, a group of civil engineers from the government sector formed the Philippine Society of Civil Engineers or PSCE, was the first civil engineering organization in the Philippines with Engineer Marshall Casilag as its first president.
In 1937, the Philippine Association of Civil Engineers or the PACE was formed from a group of civil engineers in the private sector with Engineer Enrique Santo Tomas Cortez as its first president. The objectives of both organizations were similar with each other, in which both of them wants to elevate the standard of the profession, encourage research and engineering knowledge and technology, foster fellowship among members, and promote interrelation with other technological and scientific societies.
On the year 1993, the Board of Civil Engineering at PRC held its first fully computerized board examination, which was held on May 29, 1993, and results were released on November 9, 1993.
Last March 2012, the Board of Civil Engineering wrote to Philippine Institute of Civil Engineers, or the PICE, that the board exam questions will be increased from 30/35 per subject to 100 problems per subject effective for May 2012 CE board exams. Meaning, there are 100 problems per subject or a 300-item board exam questions. The issue from National Building Code was brought by the PICE to the Court of Appeals. In January 5, 2012, the Court of Appeals of the Philippines in its decision granted the appeal of PICE and reversed the decision of the Regional Trial Court, thus giving the civil engineers the right to prepare, sign, and seal plans and designs of buildings such as vicinity map or location plan, site development plan, perspective, floor plans, elevations, sections, reflected ceilings, plans, and etc.
That would be all. Thank you.
Alfredi.